Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only primetime TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English, and I am Untitled Chapter. That's what we have prepared for you tonight. We speak to Canadian Ambassador Roman Waschuk about the pace of Ukrainian reforms. Did the Ukrainian presidential administration spread fake news to deflect criticism from international organizations? We take a deeper look into Paul Manafort's corruption in Ukraine with an American journalist, Frank Foer. Is Ukraine divided on religious ground? We also look at what Poland's new Holocaust law means for Ukraine. Uzbekistan sacks its fearsome spy master. What it means. How much do Ukraine's Western allies influence the country's internal politics? Obviously, foreign aid comes with preconditions, and some Ukrainian politicians and civil society view the West as one of the few tools to pressure a government sometimes reluctant to undergo reforms. Canada is one of the Ukrainian most devoted allies, in part because of its enormous Ukrainian diaspora. Ottawa provided sufficient support to back anti-corruption and police reforms. Hromadske sat down with the Canadian ambassador to Ukraine, Roman Waschuk, to discuss the reforms, in particular creating anti-corruption court and police reform. We also discussed the role of international partners and how they find a balance between the criticizing the Ukrainian authorities and not playing into Russia's narrative of Ukraine as a failed state.
Canada is supporting Ukraine as well as any other countries from G7, but at the same time, there are some moments where this right moment to criticize Ukrainian government for doing wrong things. What is, and civil society is quite often asking international partners to interfere, to help, to maintain, I would say, this pressure on Ukrainian authorities. What would be, according to you, the balance between criticizing Ukraine and supporting Ukraine at the same time?
Well, our group was named in 2015 when the German presidency of the G7 created the Ukraine Support Group, as opposed to the Beat Up on Ukraine group of G7 ambassadors. So I think that's how we see our role. It's to be as constructive as possible in proposing modalities, solutions, but where we see that there's a danger of things going off the rails, to also point that out. But I think certainly our chairmanship, the approach will be to engage in dialogue first, try and bridge the gaps, bring people together, and only then move to public statements. Events happen in all sorts of ways. Sometimes there may be a need to react to something overnight. I don't exclude that. But we've tried to set out an agenda that includes a range of issues so as not to become totally obsessed with only one. Yes, rule of law, fight against corruption, but also economic growth, human capital development, effective governance, the civilian side of security and defense. So those are all things we're going to be looking at, and at different times during the year we'll be sharing both privately and publicly more of our thoughts on them.
Another big issue in Ukraine now is anti-corruption, fight against corruption. We know that Canada and other G7 embassies were quite active in criticizing and trying to influence Ukrainian government back in December 2017 in order not to allow them to change anti-corruption legislation. What are, according to you, the most effective ways to keep Ukraine on the good road of reforms of anti-corruption?
I'd say we're more on the influence side, and I think there is a need for countries to follow through on commitments. We try to do that vis-a-vis Ukraine. Ukraine needs to do it vis-a-vis things like the Venice Commission recommendations. Once you say, yes, thank you for the recommendations, we're adopting them, they should be reflected as fully as possible in the legislation. Some of it has been in the initial draft, but it needs work. And so we will be engaging with both the executive and the legislative branches to try and ensure that that happens. And I know certainly my colleagues, other G7 ambassadors, are very much engaged on that as well.
Apart from the fight against corruption, what are the most important reforms in Ukraine, according to you, for the following year? What should we follow? Naftogaz, I don't know, economic reform, social reforms, etc.
I think medical reform, health reform will be very important. I think seeing some actual progress on privatization, even small and medium, and hopefully also some movement on large-scale privatization. If you think about where some of the big problems are now, that with where money flows in Ukraine, it's state-owned enterprises where that's focused on. So privatization is very important in that. Changes in the state fiscal service, because I think every taxpayer in Ukraine wants to have as constructive and good an experience in paying taxes or paying customs as possible. So I think a real emphasis on the sort of changes that Ukrainians in their oblasts, cities and towns and villages can actually sense and feel. Probably also, it may not happen this year, I hope it might, but progress towards land reform as well. Again, I know that's very controversial, but it's something that is of really great importance for rural areas in Ukraine, and rural areas have been contributing a lot to the economy and could do more.
Do you feel that Ukraine is somehow more successful in one domain of reform compared to another one?
I think there's been a lot done on reform of procurement, purchasing. By now, Prozoro is a bit overused as an example, but it is a great example and one that other countries are looking at. I think a lot is being done on the defense side, changes, and there's this whole separate process, not us G7 ambassadors. There's a defense reform advisory board that's working on that at the strategic level, plus the various military contingents, US, Canada, Poland, Lithuania, UK, working at the tactical and operational level. So a lot of changes, but a lot of expectations. So how you balance that is the big challenge for Ukrainian politicians, Ukrainian media, civil society, but also then international partners.
And maybe my last question about police reform. We know that Canada was quite active in helping Ukraine to implement this reform, but now there's still a lot of things to be done. How would you comment on this reform now in Ukraine?
It's one that happened very quickly, and when you think about it, from initiation to the first new patrol police was 7 months. Most other international projects, that's the time it takes for a preliminary feasibility study, never mind to actually put the first police officer on the streets. Now it's a matter of making it sustainable, bringing across the experience they need, and integrating it with the rest of the police force. Because you can't simply fire everybody. You need the people with 20, 30 years criminal investigation experience to get the results. So how do you synchronize the new people with the existing people, make everyone feel good, positive about what they're working on? That's what our Canadian bilateral police mission is working on. We've got 20 veteran Canadian police officers here, looking maybe to even possibly increase that in the coming year. So helping people work together and helping people move forward positively and helping solve crime, make people feel safer, that's our priority for police reform in 2018.
For the full version of this interview, as well as our other reports, go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua. Also sign up for our newsletter in the upper right-hand corner of the webpage. Search Hromadske International on Facebook and Twitter. It's @Hromadske. We are there 24/7 for you. And we're starting this part of the show with Serhiy Sidorenko, who is the editor of European Pravda, the online independent publication which look into the depth of the Ukrainian international relations and way more, because it's Serhiy who had broken the story this week regarding the controversy which had happened. Trying to be brief, the question is it the truth that Ukrainian government, in particularly the administration of the Ukrainian president, was trying to spin a fake story, fake news story, which would claim that the relations with international partners, in particular IMF and the World Bank, are way better, that they are considered and portrayed, and that the leaders of those organizations didn't really knew about the letters they previously had sent to the their local departments had sent to the Ukrainian leadership, and that they were not so pushy with the creation of the anti-corruption court. As well, this part of the spin story, which was published at some of the Ukrainian publication, had said that for that one of the employees of the World Bank was fired. Before we go for that, I'll just really would like to suggest to listen to that story which had been proliferated via Ukrainian media and which happened to be not really correct.
The head of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, didn't know anything about the ultimatum letter sent on behalf of the IMF to the presidential administration demanding the creation of the anti-corruption court. According to Glavcom's sources, Lagarde said this during her meeting with the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko in Davos. She also promised to carry out an investigation into how this letter appeared in the media. Our sources also told us that the World Bank is firing Serhiy Sidorenko, its director for Belarus, Moldova and Ukraine, who signed the World Bank's letter to Ukraine which criticized the president's bill on the anti-corruption court. Its leak to the media is among the reasons for such decisions.
To be frank, when I discovered that on Glavcom website and on some other websites, I was not so hesitant to publish that disapproval of the story, because it was completely out of logic. It is not possible that head of regional director of World Bank would direct the letter to Ukrainian authorities not agreeing that with their chiefs, with Washington. So
I would just explain, we do have these two letters. There were letters by the World Bank sent on the January 15th and from the IMF sent on the January 11th to the president administration, to the chairman of the parliament, to a number of the Ukrainian politicians, where they were pretty tough.
Yeah, quite tough and unexpectedly tough, I would say, as for those international financial institutions. Their position was not so surprising, because everyone knows that our international partners are demanding from Ukraine to establish the anti-corruption court, which is inconsistent with Ukrainian obligations, and the one court that would be in line with recommendations of Venice Commission of Council of Europe. So it was clear, but those letters were quite tough in their language. So later IMF even confirmed that in official statement of their communication director in Washington. So everything was clear, everything was public, and then some Ukrainian media referring to their sources in presidential administration are publishing a news that, well, it is a fake, so there were no letters, or letters were not consistent with the position of IMF and World Bank, and even some high-level people are fired. It was completely out of logic. So first days I was trying to ignore it. But later it appeared to be that not only those few news outlets, but also, as we say in Ukraine, leaders of public opinion in social networks have started to disperse that story very actively, and, well, saying that there were no demands to Poroshenko. Everything goes on fine with anti-corruption court. So Poroshenko's law is perfect and so on. Then I decided that it's a time to intervene. So it was very easy. I just wrote a request, so a mail request to World Bank and to IMF. And immediately, in several hours, I've got answers from both institutions that, well, guys, we are so happy that you finally asked us, because none of these media who said that Poroshenko have heard that from Lagarde and from head of World Bank, no one asked them as us, and it's complete fake.
So before we go, I would just suggest to listen some quotes from both of the answers to you, from both IMF and the World Bank, just for our audience to warn. We've translated that from Ukrainian, so it's a double translation, but online you can read the correct and ideal version of those answers. So please, let's play it one by one.
The IMF is looking forward to cooperating with the Ukrainian government and other international partners to resolve the issues we previously highlighted in the current anti-corruption court draft law and to make it fully comply with the recommendation from the Venice Commission of the Council of Europe and with Ukraine's responsibilities within the IMF cooperation program. The information about Serhiy Sidorенko's firing is untrue. It would be better if the mass media checked the veracity of something before sharing it.
Both institutions confirmed that their positions are remaining as they were, and also World Bank had an opportunity to send Serhiy Sidorенko, their regional director, to one of TV shows in Ukraine, and she confirmed also that all these requirements are still there. So I would explain the key issue. President Poroshenko have submitted a draft law on anti-corruption court to Verkhovna Rada late last year. But all, I would say even not most, but all Ukrainian activists who are involved in anti-corruption issue have said that this draft law is completely not in line with Ukrainian obligations under this process, and they are not in line with the recommendations of our international partners. So our international partners are demanding to establish the anti-corruption court that would be completely independent in their decisions. So it requires several measures, like, for instance, you have to select judges accordingly, you have to guarantee that they are not under influence of political parties, and also it's very important to establish that this court is created immediately or as soon as possible. So these shortcomings of presidential draft was first that selection procedure allowed him to appoint judges that he does want. So it is not so directly, but it does not guarantee independence. And another key issue was that provisions of presidential draft allowed not to create the court immediately. So in fact, it allowed to postpone the creation for years. And it was completely unacceptable for all international partners of Ukraine.
What is also important, just for your knowledge as well, that in a private or professional communication with some of the members of the presidential administration, our colleagues from Hromadske had also received kind of a message, a phone message, while discussing totally different issue that, you know, that's not that clear, that story with the letters from IMF. The Christine Lagarde didn't know about those letters sent previously. So kind of we can confirm that this message were coming from the presidential administration. My final question then would be, what is a follow-up, because we didn't get it, from actually the administration of president after you have broken that story and after you've kind of proved that there is something happening.
Indeed. I would say that it's...
Did they answer you?
No, they did not answer me because I did not have what to ask them directly, because there was no document signed by some people from the administration, but it was disbursed via the network of their loyals. But this case was unique in Ukrainian history, because we have a lot of fakes that are produced by different political forces, not only by presidential administration. And this was probably the first one when all people related to this story had to apologize that they distributed that fake information. And by the way, presidential administration did not deny that it was behind of it.
They didn't deny it, but as well, we are also would be happy to hear and be given the floor always to the presidential administration to answer. For that, not always have the response, but as I said, like when they want, when we are more than happy to provide their position for the international audience. Thanks a lot. That was Serhiy Sidorenko, who is the editor of European Pravda, one of the leading Ukrainian independent publications looking into the Ukrainian international relations. Journalist Franklin Foer is likely the world expert on Paul Manafort, a former campaign manager for Donald Trump and longtime consultant to ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. Manafort has allegedly laundered more than $75 million of US dollars from Ukraine through offshore accounts. Foer has just published a long, in-depth investigation into Manafort. Now he joins Hromadske by Skype to discuss his findings and provide more details on Manafort's activities in Ukraine.
So he was intimately involved in every aspect of the discussion about the European Union and joining the European Union. That he was involved in brokering discussions between the foreign ministry and Yanukovych. That in the later stages of the Yanukovych administration, Yanukovych closed himself off to his advisors. Everything became about his family. And he stopped even talking to some of his ministers. But Manafort always had this special power to talk to Yanukovych. And so if, say, the foreign minister wanted to send a message to Yanukovych, he could use Manafort to help send that sort of message. And I have to tell you, just when I was in Kiev and I could see some of the files and parts of, say, like the Ministry of Justice, it was incredible to me the extent to which I could see Paul Manafort and his operation helping to edit press releases and documents, that he wasn't just involved at the highest level in conversations with Yanukovych. It wasn't a superficial relationship, that he was deeply, deeply involved in governing.
If we speak about Manafort coming to this country, yes, he was more or less sent by the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, who has some of the assets in this country in the heavy industry. But really, how Manafort got hired by later the Ukrainian president, with whom of the Ukrainian businessmen and oligarchs he was communicating, who actually paid him.
Right. So Manafort came here because he was working for the Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, and he came at the very, very end of the 2004 presidential election to help give almost an assessment, an intelligence report to Deripaska about what was happening. And through Deripaska introduced him to Rinat Akhmetov, and they developed an independent sort of relationship in the course of the 2004 campaign and during the Orange Revolution. And so Akhmetov helped kind of make this connection to Yanukovych. And so when Yanukovych was in the Czech Republic just after the Orange Revolution, Manafort's team went to go meet with him. And then Yanukovych returned to Kiev and met with Manafort himself, and they developed this relationship that would, sometimes it would have highs, sometimes it would have lows. It wasn't a perfect relationship, but it became a fairly close one. And ultimately, when Yanukovych needed to trust somebody, he would constantly turn back to Paul Manafort.
This Sunday, Kiev residents took to the streets in protest to speak out against the legitimization of paramilitary movements in Ukraine. They carried signs that read, "When people march in formation, there is no freedom," and "Society without violence." This was a response to a previous demonstration that had shocked many in Ukraine, the appearance of far-right national DRUZHYNA movement.
Not everyone in our society agrees with the emergence of another military organization connected to the radical right. Personally, I'm scared of the increase in the quantity and the prominence of these organizations in the Ukrainian society today. That's why I'm here today, to say that I'm against this.
De facto, all the expressions of our views will now be controlled by politically biased people. In reality, the situation that we have in Ukraine now will show whether Ukraine is immune to fascism. And the fact that the artistic intelligentsia who organized this meeting today is outraged means that Ukraine is fighting Nazism.
Last week, almost 600 members of an organization founded by veterans of the far-right Azov Battalion swore an oath to defend public order in the center of Kiev. What is National DRUZHYNA? What it is trying to do, and does it have the right to do that? And what it is its connection to the police? Our team has prepared an explainer for you, which you can find on our webpage en.hromadske.ua. Recently, a scandal erupted in Ukraine after a priest in the city of Zaporizhia refused to carry out a funeral ceremony for a 2-year-old child who had been tragically killed. The problem? The priest was from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. And the boy had been baptized in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Kyiv Patriarchate. The incident has created the impression that Ukraine is divided along theological ground. And indeed, since the start of the war, Russian-Ukrainian war in the Donbass in 2014, the politics of religion has grown more complicated. Increasingly, some Orthodox churches are moving from the Moscow to the Kyiv Patriarchate. But religion in Ukraine is far from not a divide. Different faiths and sects coexist in the country. To discuss religion in Ukraine, we are joined by ANDRIY YURASH, Director of the Department for Religious Affairs and Nationalities of the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, and a well-known expert on religion. Thank you for joining us. But before the discussion, we would like to suggest you watch our report on how some churches are moving from the Moscow Patriarchate to the Kyiv Patriarchate. Hromadske traveled to Western Ukraine to talk with residents of 2 towns where such moves have occurred and learned more about the controversial what had been caused.
In the beginning of January 2018, a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate refused to perform a funeral service for a child who was baptized at a Kyiv Patriarchate church. He explained that his decision followed church laws. This case provoked a huge reaction across Ukraine and sparked discussion across relations between the 2 Orthodox churches. Ukraine's Ministry of Culture says that around 80 communities in 20 Ukrainian regions have switched from Moscow to Kyiv Patriarchate between 2014 and 2017. The largest number of switches took place in Ternopil and Rivne regions. So we go to Ternopil to get a first-hand account of how and why believers from both churches divide the local church buildings between themselves. This is Butyn, Ternopil Oblast. In 2014, 330 out of 460 believers switched from Moscow to Kyiv Patriarchate here. ANDRIY ZHYLA, the current head of Butyn, says that it was the Euromaidan events that were the last straw.
A Moscow Patriarchate priest refused to perform a funeral service over the people who died at Euromaidan. It was a remembrance day and the priest refused it just like that.
Did he explain the decision?
He said that he didn't know whether there were any Orthodox believers among them. Maybe they were Greek Catholics, or maybe they weren't baptized at all. He said he just won't do it. They didn't request the service in the right way, he said. 80% of the village was offended by this case, and the next day they started coming in to say that they wanted to switch. We won't serve Moscow when our boys are dying, they said.
The Moscow Patriarchate representatives were offered to take up the house next to the church, but they refused this offer and went to court.
There were many court cases, and all of them were won by us, the Kyiv Patriarchate, so they saw where it was all going. We appealed to many institutions, but in the end they just started building their own church.
The local believers say that the Moscow Patriarchate representatives use their own resources to build it.
We're building it. There are 60 households in Butyn, and they did not switch. They just seized them, smashed the doors, broke into here, and started performing their services.
We are now in Novostav, Ternopil region. This is where one of the first in the region church switches from Moscow to Kiev took place in 2014. Despite there being numerous court hearings and fights, they agreed to serve in turns.
When someone wants to be political, they start referring to Euromaidan, Crimea, and Putin, but that's all politics, and we do religion here, so when someone switches churches on these grounds, it doesn't make sense to me. We go to churches to pray not for Putin, not for Russia. We pray to God, we confess our sins. That's just absurd. Moreover, since 1991, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is fully independent from Moscow, both financially and administratively. We don't pay any taxes or anything to them.
Since time immemorial, the church has always been like this. We crossed ourselves, we married, and so on. So why should we switch now? There are many churches out there, enough to be switching on a daily basis. And everything that was going on here, it was terrible. They broke in, they used force and offended everyone. We haven't got anything to do with Putin. Who is he to us? Do we look like Muscovites?
An hour later, the representatives of Kyiv Patriarchate come in.
Everyone perfectly understands what's going on in the country, and they know who the occupant is. It's just absurd to have the church under the Moscow jurisdiction. People want to hear their language here.
The whole village, apart from 11 houses, signed up to switch to the Kyiv Patriarchate. At the moment, everything is calm here. Thank God. Of course the village is divided. That's an unpleasant subject to me because I didn't want it to be like this.
Ternopil Regional Administration says that at the moment there are no conflicts between the communities. Any decision to switch is made through the administration according to the Ukrainian law.
All the decisions have been made at the general meetings between the communities. The community made the decision, we prepared the documents. Afterward, we made all the amendments here at the regional state administration. The court hearings are still ongoing, but I can tell you, some settlements in Ternopil region are already building new churches. They make requests, the local governments provide them with land, they use the money from donations. It's all down to the people, donations, sponsors, benefactors.
As of January, there are currently 4 cases on moving from the Moscow to Kyiv Patriarchate.
So, Andriy, we watched the report. What does it signify? What should our foreign audience understand from what's going on?
This fact, what you described, what happened in Zaporizhia, is just one sign of the very high temperature inside the religious environment of the country, and the process of changing the jurisdiction and moving from one patriarchate to another one. That is a very big and broad process which is taking place very actively for the last several years. At least 3 or 4 years we are counting almost in different form and on different stages hundreds of cases related to this process. In other cases, this process on the stage of very active discussion, sometimes on very conflictual level. And exactly any state official cannot be silent in this situation. That's why we are trying to prepare some our suggestions. How can regional authorities can solve these problems? And that's why inside the expert council affiliated with our department of the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine, we prepared the draft of special law. It is trying.
What we will suggest, if to be very brief?
Briefly, we suggest that the member of this community collect together, discussing the situation, and according to the decision of the majority, community and the whole property which belong to the community will go to one or another jurisdiction.
What I would like to draw our attention, we have here a map. You can see what percentage of Ukrainians belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate and Kiev Patriarchate. As everywhere we see, from the west to the east, north and south, predominantly there is more believers of the Kiev Patriarchate.
At the same time, we can count that according to the number of existing and acting institutional organizations, the communities, what are registered according to the Ukrainian legislation, Moscow Patriarchate can great majority. Now we have in the country around 12,000 communities that belong to the Moscow Patriarchate in the country. Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the canonical subordination to the Moscow Patriarchate. And totally around 6,000 parishes or religious organizations belong to Kiev Patriarchate and Autocephalous Church. So, excuse me, but it's very important for my mind. The number of parishes is much higher affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, but at the same time, the number of believers is 2 times bigger to the Kiev Patriarchate. And that's why people is trying to change the affiliation of their institution from Moscow Patriarchate parishes toward the Kiev.
So actually, because of that, I would like to ask the particular that you see the Kyiv Patriarchate, Moscow Patriarchate, then the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, these are the 7%, as well the Roman Catholic Church, it's among 1% of Ukrainian believers, and others. What I understand, the others includes the Muslims, Jews, and different other sects, and Buddhist, and all the New Age faiths. Andriy, my question would be, of course, for a lot of people, especially what we've seen from the reports, the Moscow Patriarchate, really has the connection to Russia, to the Kremlin, because really there is the, it's not a secret that there is a strong political influence of the Kremlin to the Moscow Patriarchate. At the same time, we know that there are some believers who could be considered by somebody, even the Ukrainian nationalist, who just believes in genuinity of that particular church and may still stay with the Moscow Patriarchate. But with the war, how political is that, and how politics plays into today's religion? Is it really the divide, or what word you would use?
That picture, what we are discussing right now, has been stated first time, I remember, at the end of even 1990s. So that's nothing absolutely new. But political situation of the last several years, especially the Ukrainian-Russian war in the eastern borders of the country, exaggerated this process.
But would we speak about the religious divide as a political instrument, as a political reality?
Unfortunately, these 2 directions of orthodoxy, I mean, subordinated toward Moscow and toward Kiev Patriarchate, have very different political views. Sometimes they have even different identificational priorities. The first one, closely related to Moscow, has obviously pro-Russian and Russian identity. In Armenian Orthodoxy, which under the jurisdiction of Kiev Patriarchate, now has more pro-European view. And
so, in order to explain the how it plays to the whole society, we also prepared, using the sources which are quoted on our webpage, how religious is generally the population. So what we see that the half of the Ukrainians are moderately religious, 28% unsure, could be likely a believer, 5% unsure, likely not a believer, and we have 7% of deeply religious people, some of them, a small percentage didn't answer it, and 9% atheist. So in the way, would you really say, according to what we know, is Ukrainian society religious society? To what extent, generally, having all that amount of religious plays to the everyday life of the Ukrainians?
Everything is very relative. If we will compare with the situation in the Ukrainian society like 20, 25, 30 years ago, exactly Ukrainian society becoming more and more religious. But if we compare the situation with other countries, for example...
Can you compare with some European and maybe
For example,
Russian?
Poland, Italy, Ukrainian society is much less, almost 2 times less religious.
Compared to Russia?
much more religious. But if we will take the most unreligious societies like Czech one, Estonian, other Baltic states, the level of religiosity in the country in 2, even in 3 times higher than in these countries.
To which country Ukraine could be compared, and what this, let's say, diversity, or somebody would use the word divide, signifies, how Ukraine could be explained through that lens?
Diversity in religious area, as in other areas, is a part of our heritage, and I think very important. Religious diversity in the country influence other areas, for example, the political area. Very hard to compare with other countries in Europe because the situation in Ukraine very unique for the Eastern Europe, very different from Western Europe, and according to the principle of organization of relation between the state and the religious organization, we can be compared with the American system because Ukraine provides real religious freedom and support diversity in any forms. In the difference toward Russia, for example, when the main Russian Orthodox Church always support this unique and totalitarian view on other religions. The system of differences among religions in Ukraine, it is a reason why we have this unique perception and understanding of others as our neighbors, as my neighbors, as your neighbors.
And a smaller but also an important Christian faith in Ukraine is Protestantism. Since the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Protestants have come to play a greater role in supporting the Ukrainian military and helping civilians affected by war. We know also that a lot of them had to move from now currently occupied DNR and LNR, where some of the Protestants were not welcomed. We would like to show the report and then discuss it.
The front line is the most interesting place. In civilian life, there are problems, disagreements between priests from different sects. Here on the front line, everyone gets along fine, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. We're going to pick up our guys, missionaries in Avdivka who are serving and helping the local population. Who's in charge here? Does anyone know her?
Tanya knows.
Grandma Valia, give us an empty bag. We'll give you some potatoes.
He visited me.
In the winter after the shelling.
He visited me.
A day or two later, we were here. How did you make it through the shelling?
I'm telling you, son. I sleep there. It was already 8 in the evening. I didn't understand anything. Then whoosh! Everything shuddered. The wind started blowing. All the windows and doors opened and the wind started blowing again. As I was getting up, everything here was open. I had such beautiful flowers, but everything froze.
The window was blown off by a shell in the winter. Now they've covered it with plastic sheeting. The glass was blown out, so we covered that with a rug. Okay, no need to escort us any further. Close the door. We're heading out. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Donbass is a region where the Protestant communities were in majority according to the number of institutions registered by the state. So that was the region where 6 to 8% from the population were the members of this community, comparing to 3 in the scale of the whole country. So Ukraine, contemporary, modern, independent Ukraine created the circumstances for Protestant communities to develop their identity. That's why they define Ukraine as real, their motherland. That's why they became Protestants in the region. The most active part of that part of population that opposed to the Russian aggression. That's why they were staying for Ukraine as a country and as a circumstance for their development for the future. As a state, which offered for them absolute possibilities for development and the process of evangelization, what is the most important for any Protestant.
So, Andriy, thank you so much. Andriy YURASH is the director of the Department for Religious Affairs and Nationalities of the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine and a well-known expert on religions. But before I'm saying goodbye, we also encourage to go to Hromadske Facebook page, Hromadske International, and also to our webpage, en.hromadske.ua, where you can find the full version for our stories and also the stories and the full version of the reports on the situation with the religion in our region. Thank you. This week, Uzbekistan's President Shavkat Mirziyoyev sacked the much-feared chief of the country's security service, Rustam Inayatov. For 23 years, Inayatov was a rarely seen but exceedingly powerful force who helped turn the country into a police state where dissent was not tolerated and torture was routine. He was viewed by many as the grey cardinal of Uzbek politics. However, after President Islam Karimov's death in September 2016, Shavkat Mirziyoyev became president and began to implement a series of reforms aimed at opening up the country's economy. Inayatov was long regarded as key obstacle to those reforms. Hromadske finds out what his removal means for Uzbekistan.
Well, Inayatov had been in charge of the National Security Service since the very beginning. You know, even when he came in as the chief of the National Security Service in 1995, he had already been a major player behind the scene before that. And that was the time when President Islam Karimov, who was trying to consolidate his power. Those were very crucial years for him. He wanted someone strong enough, not just, professionally solid at that very moment, but also who had a lot of political and social capital in Uzbekistan to be in charge of a service that he wanted to actually eventually become a very strong force, basically a force that would control Uzbekistan, that would control the system in a way that serves him, President Karimov. And that I've always seen as an attempt to create this monster, which then SMB, which is how it is known in the society, National Security Service, emerged to be. Essentially, Karimov ended up creating a monster that he wanted so much, which became so powerful that at the end it was actually capable of swallowing the presidency itself up. It became a very strong machine that essentially controlled the entire country, not just its life inside the country, but also outside, all the relations, everything. That also had the control to oversee the lives of the Uzbek people abroad, and that was all Inayatov's work. Basically, that was his strategy. That was his vision. Inayatov became so omnipresent. When we see the National Security Service, people would think of this guy, Inayatov, and he was rarely seen in public. Many Uzbeks have never seen him. I mean, if you show them his picture, they won't even recognize. But the word Inayatov became synonymous with brutality, with torture, with repression. He became the symbol of the SNB, and SNB represented so many horrible things that were happening inside the country.
After President Islam Karimov died in September 2016, Mirziyoyev came to power and he began to implement a series of reforms which appear to be largely aimed at opening the country up economically. And removing Inayatov is seen as one of the important steps both in consolidating power and advancing the reforms. Why was Inayatov's removal so critical for these economic reforms?
What's happening in Uzbekistan right now is, this is President Mirziyoyev consolidating his power, strengthening his position, right? And obviously he cannot do this with the old guard, at least with some of its members. And Inayatov, as we've just said, has been one of the key players in this. And obviously he doesn't want the reforms. He's not seen as someone who wanted change. He was seen as someone who wanted to maintain the status quo. He obviously wanted to maintain, stability and peace within the regime, but he also is on the way of making any kind of major change. And what we have seen for the past 1 year is that Mirziyoyev wants to make change. And Inayatov represents the old guard. And he's a powerful figure, and his followers are still going to be in the system. But I think by removing him, at least getting rid of him symbolically, Mirziyoyev has gained a lot of, obviously, credibility and some ground to maneuver, to bring about the kind of changes that he wants. But, he's still not going anywhere. I mean, he's out, but he's not really out. He's just become a senator. He's now a presidential advisor. My sources tell me that Inayatov will not be around much physically. He won't be very much present in Tashkent. But this is a painful compromise, I think, not just for President Mirziyoyev, but for the people of the country, because they know that under Inayatov, the National Security Service committed a lot of crimes, committed a lot of evil acts, and just by letting him go, in the eyes of many Uzbeks, this is such injustice, they tell us.
The Polish Senate this week passed a controversial law on the Institute of National Remembrance, which punishes those who blame Poles for Nazi war crimes. It also prohibits the Bandera ideology associated with Ukrainian nationalists who were responsible for the 1943-1944 Volyn massacre. The law sparked controversy not only in Ukraine but amid other countries, including the United States and Israel. Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko said the bill punishes those who support Ukrainian nationalism. In previous show, we discussed how memory politics play a significant role in the relationships between Ukraine and Poland. Today, Polish political commentator Wojciech Przybylski explained how that law might work and if it can.
The wording of the law and the technical aspects of the law put lots of question marks, as many as the intention of several MPs who already started to imagine those who would be penalized under this law, the symbolic enemies of this political camp. And that is the biggest controversy, and this is the biggest problem from a general point of view. And then there is a specific problem, I would say, circumstances when the law has been adopted. The law apparently has not went through the proper procedure of agreeing on that between through the MFA, through diplomatic channels. The law is not specific you don't have a wording Polish concentration camps or concentration camps as such. This is about defamation. A defamation, according to the legal experts that I've been reading, I'm not one of them, applies usually to a person. However, this specific law intends to give the same qualities as a natural person has, you, me, anyone perhaps watching this, to a bit of an abstract term, Polish nation. Nobody knows what Polish nation is, and how can you have a somehow insulted the memory of it. Therefore.
And can you explain?
Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International for being with us this hour. We are here for you 24/7, so for the full version of the stories, reports, interviews, go to en.hromadske.ua as well. Search us on Facebook and Twitter, search for Hromadske International. We are here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you.